like the Babylonians, the Akkadians. The Sumerians don't seem to have moved too far outside of that southern Iraq area. Another thing that we have to get into our brains, and this is just hard, is how many fewer people there were. So the Roman civilization at its height probably encompassed somewhere between 50 and 80 million people spread across an area that's many times the size of the United States. And that's at its height, that's at its largest. Many of these civilizations that we're talking about were maybe 5 or 10 million at most. And think of that, like we just have things on a scale that are unmanageable in this world. You know, there's no city like Chicago or New York. There's no massive hub like that. There are, but they'll be like 100,000 people, 200,000 people. I'm not sure. It would be really interesting to look up when the first city that reached 1 million people happened. But in lots of cases, you really don't want to live in a city, because when you have that many people next to each other, you have a few major problems. Besides grouchy neighbors. You have the problem of fires and disease from sewage, because you can't get rid of it very easily. They don't have indoor plumbing. And so people died all the time. The deadliest things in this world are infections. There's no antibiotics. So every little cut that a kid gets, I mean, think of your own children and people that you know. And, you know, now getting an infection, getting a wound infected isn't that big of a deal. In this world, most of the time, that kills people. So they died constantly. And if those things didn't kill them, then famine did. And if famine didn't kill them, then the wars did. Like, people, and, you know, there's all kinds of stuff. Like, some of them had a sense of medicine and a sense of things that they could do. Like ancient Egyptians, they've discovered Egyptian skeletons, for instance, that the Egyptians had figured out limb amputation. So like if a limb got crushed by a rock, they figured out how to cut it off and actually have the person survive. That wasn't rediscovered in Europe for like many, many thousands of years. But people that lived to old age were relatively rare. Childbirth is extremely traumatic. Lots of women died having children. Lots of children died. This is a kind of world where people might have 10 kids and only 2 of them survive past infancy. And so there's all kinds of things. And some of this feels shocking, but to get to the world of Jesus, it's like we have to navigate out of the world that we live in today. And there's just, you know, so you have to imagine like civilizations, but there aren't mega capitals with millions of people scattered all over the earth. There's a handful of them, like 3 at a time in the entire world. And lots of times stuff is expanding and contracting, getting built, getting knocked down, that kind of stuff. The Fertile Crescent, they used irrigation from the rivers. This area had a relatively stable climate, protection from enemies. They had a source of food production and water. The area between the rivers isn't as deserty as we would think. It can get hot, especially now, but at this time period, about 5,000 years ago, it wasn't as hot as it is now. That has developed, that's one of the things that has changed. It's probably not cold. It's not the North Pole. They are not Eskimos with giant fur coats, but it was warmer and wetter than it is now. At least somewhat relatively so. Okay, questions so far? Does your brain feel scrambled? You shouldn't yet. We're just getting started. Yes, Betty is pointing to there's a correlation also, as far as we can tell, between the development of language and the development of writing. Some cultures were oral cultures, and some wrote things down. And the sad part is that we really only have records from the people that wrote things down. Like, in this early time period, there's all sorts of funny things. Like, the Sumerians were the ones that wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, if you've heard of it before. And they talk about an ancient flood, like a biblical flood, and this king, I think his name like Utnapishtim or something, who lived. He becomes Gilgamesh in later language, and he traveled around and there's boats, but they talk about him living like 60,000 years before them. It's a little bit hard to know. Because writing is more difficult, they seem to only write really important things, like the names of kings. They would tell stories of their gods. They have those kind of things. The Epic of Gilgamesh does survive in pieces and in various places. But because it was likely an oral story, it exists in all kinds of different versions. People have slightly different names. The places are slightly different. Stuff that gets confused over time. But there's a great connection. There's so much history involved in this stuff. I hope you get excited and want to look at it. But we have to move on to Egypt. So Egypt is the first civilization on a global or a world scale, if you can talk about it at that time. It's relatively well protected, but their civilization exists in only a couple miles out from the Nile River. So you can follow the course of the Nile and draw a patch that's about 5 or 6 miles on either side, and that's where they lived. If you look at a map of Egypt today, their entire population, except for a handful of oases, is crammed into the same area. And it's creating all kinds of problems. But Egypt is relatively unrivaled at its time. Egypt was a civilization and doing things on a scale that is almost unimaginable to any other people at this time in the world. And we have to kind of reset our expectations, because the Great Pyramid, for instance, dates to around 2600 BC. So 4,600 years ago. It predates Abraham. When Abraham was in Egypt, he saw the Great Pyramid. And he probably saw it when it was still encased in limestone. The Great Pyramid, as it is now, is not what it looked like. Its limestone casing is missing. It was a glowing white thing, possibly with a golden or basalt capstone. The top of the pyramid was a really important rock in the Egyptian lore and their stuff, and it got lost. But it's really, really old. So by the time of Abraham, or by the time of the Exodus, this is a better one, the Exodus was further away from the Great Pyramid than we are from the Middle Ages. Like, the time scale that we're talking about, you just have to reframe. You have to constantly put it into numbers and try and contextualize it. By the time of Jesus, the Great Pyramid was already 600 years old. So Jesus probably saw it. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you have to just work on when you're getting into this. And 600 years ago, this country wasn't here. It didn't exist. They didn't even know about it. Not really. 1,000 years ago was probably about the first time that someone sailed here from the east. We know that there were people living here, but they were by and large relatively small societies, and they migrated around. Most of the people of Egypt live along the lower Nile River. Now, rivers work backwards. This is one of the other things that is really hard to remember, is rivers don't work north and south. So the upper isn't the north, and the lower isn't the south. The lower is closer to the ocean where it's going, and the upper is where it starts. So most of Egyptian civilization, most of the people live in Lower Egypt near the river. This was one of the most fertile grain production areas of the ancient world. The Egyptians were really, really good at raising crops. And part of it was they had this sort of uneasy balance with the river. The Nile River would flood every spring and deposit a bunch of muck, just like the Red River does. And when it did, that muck is very, very fertile, untilled soil. So they had lots of patches of land along the river where they grew things. They grew lots of crops, and it would flood every year. And then in the time after the flood, people would go out into these fields and rebuild trenches and do all that stuff. And then they would, depart. Much of the monumental architecture in Egypt dates from this time period called the Old Kingdom. There's likely only between 1 and 5 million people in their entire civilization at a time. So it's like a Minneapolis-sized group of people, and that's it, in their entire civilization. You can look up a lot more about Egypt, but we're going to move on to what is called the Bronze Age collapse. There's debates about whether this really happens and how much it was and how bad it was. But what's interesting, so like in Egypt, the end of the Bronze Age coincides with the interdynastic periods, they're called, and they were times of upheaval where foreign rulers ruled Egypt. So it's the transition from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom, and the transition from the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom. There's 3 different major time periods of ancient Egyptian history. They're called Old, Middle, and New, and they coincide with many of the times that Israel was there. There were times of upheaval where Egypt lost a lot of its territory in farther flung provinces like Israel, and where civilizations like the Babylonians or others would invade and conquer. So Israel was being fought over quite regularly at this time. In this transition out of the Bronze Age, which is around 1300 BC, there's this group called the Sea Peoples. And we don't know exactly who they are, except they come from the north and the west, probably from an area near Greece, and they land and invade countries and cultures all over the region. And they're able to do this and establish settlements because of these upheavals, because there's not a unified power to oppose them. And so they build settlements like Phoenicia in Israel. And they build settlements like Carthage, and lots of the stuff that's along the coast where it's easy to sail boats to, the Sea Peoples come. It's this great migration of people. And this great migration of people changes the political map. The dynasties collapse. The Sumerians depart. The Babylonians become significantly weaker. That's the time of the foundation of ancient Israel, the Exodus, the Judges, the development of the early, the period of the Judges takes probably around 300 years. This is also the beginning of the Iron Age, which is a new and stronger material. It means your things are sharper and better and pierce through more armor than the other people's if you have iron. And so you start winning more of the battles. And technology, insofar as it's, as we would call it, is growing. This is also the shake-up, the political earthquake, that leads to the rise of Rome and Greece, which hopefully we'll take up next time. So it's kind of this, it's not necessarily a hard line that you draw in the sand and say like, okay, this is the year. There's not necessarily a year where it happens, but in this transition of about 50 or 100 years, maybe 200 years, you have the widespread change of the political map of the world, especially in this region, so the Eastern Mediterranean basin. And it's important. Like this kind of stuff, like I said, I think we have to come to appreciate, in a sense, how we could say providence is at work. Because if the Egyptians were still as powerful as they were in the time of the building of the pyramids, they wouldn't have welcomed a group of outsiders like the Israelites to come in to their land. They were much more nationalistic. They would have, probably marked it as an invasion and killed them. And so they're able to come probably because of the upheaval, because society is more disorganized and things are much less centralized than now. And we're going to discover this again and again. There's all kinds of times in history where it's like, that worked out really well. And that's especially the case when we get to Greece and Rome. Let's see, next. Okay, so next week we're going to start with civilization in Israel and hopefully get to Greece and Rome. The goal is to get through Greece and Rome relatively soon, but I've only written notes so far on Greece, and there's a lot of them. And then Rome will come after that, and then we have to do Judaism part 2 and talk about stuff like the groups in the time of Jesus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and then we'll be into the book. So this is a little bit of the pre-biblical history, but it's going to be, these each become more and more important as we get closer to the biblical story. For instance, the Egyptians and the Egyptian gods are a significant part of the Exodus story. It's well worth reading because if you look at, for instance, the biblical plagues in Exodus, at one point the Bible says it's God executing judgment on the Egyptian gods. So stuff like the Nile turns to blood. Well, they worshipped the Nile. The sun shuts off for 3 days. The major Egyptian god is the sun god, probably because they live in a desert, which is as hot as the surface of the sun, and the sun was always trying to kill you. So you start to worship it so that it doesn't. But you can look at the entire set of biblical plagues and you'll find a matching Egyptian god for every single one of them. And there are parts of ancient Egypt that the Israelites seem to be fond of. Like the Egyptians had invented stuff like different kinds of irrigation and different kinds of flood walls, and they had these corkscrew things that they could use to move water uphill. They were masters of geometry. Like the Egyptians knew that the world was round, and they knew almost exactly how big it was because they used sundials, and someone was smart enough to calculate the angle of the sun to create the shadow, and they did it in 2 places at the same day, at the same time. We're not exactly sure how they figured that one out, but they did. And they were able to see or figure out that Egypt was a tiny part of a giant circle, and so they figured out how big the world was. Again, that's something that took Europeans a heck of a long time to do. And they're like, we discovered it. And the Egyptians are like, yeah, we did that 3,500 years ago. Welcome to the party. So there's things that they were extremely good at that, the biblical people probably picked up.
When did the pyramids start? Did they build the pyramids?
When did the pyramids start? So the Great Pyramid we know is in about 2600 BC. It seems to be one of the oldish ones. It's a little bit hard to figure out exactly when and who built all the pyramids, because sometimes like a new pharaoh would go back and erase all of the old pharaoh's stuff and then make his own stuff. They just chop it out of the rock and redo the surface and then rewrite the story to be about them. We're not exactly sure how many times that happened or if it happened, but I think the great age of pyramid building comes to an end with the great pyramids on the Giza Plateau, I believe. So those are some of the last ones. Before that, they built smaller pyramids. They built one that collapsed, and so they changed the angle of it. That's called the bent pyramid. Before the pyramids, they built these old brick tombs that are called mastabas, and those are of various sizes, but they would make these mud bricks from river mud, and then they'd bake them in the sun, probably like a kind of clay. And those, I think, date to around 3000-ish BC, give or take. So that's as close as I can get you.
So that's before the Bronze Age.
Yes. Yeah, pyramids are, I'm not sure, the early Bronze Age would coincide with the rise of Egyptian civilization. So there, I think about 3000 BC is a transition between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. But I'm not exactly sure. I didn't get to do all of the research that I would like. So those are things that are fun to look up on your own if you're curious. Any other questions? All right, I will let you dive into some table discussions. There are some questions that start on the bottom of page 10. And I realize you might not know as much about this time period, but I think it's good to start talking anyway. It's going to get easier as we get closer to Jesus, and we'll have less time to cover and fewer years. So, sorry, it's just the way history works. There's just a lot of it.